Hello everyone, friends. As we know, in our world there are rich and successful countries with a high income level, with beautiful cities and smooth roads, and then there are poor countries with a low standard of living and other accompanying attributes. Why is that? Different politicians, parties, even religious movements respond in their own ways. The common discussion involves mantras about democracy, freedom of speech, power change, a liberal economy, no corruption, and fair courts. These elements are believed to ensure prosperity. This is the narrative of the opposition and the West. They say that if all of this is present in any country, then it will inevitably be prosperous. The so-called opposition and the West in general are talking about this. Another part of people says that everything is much simpler. What's there to guess? Some countries just have enough resources, which is why they are rich, while others do not. But what resources do countries like Denmark, Switzerland, or England have that Russia doesn't? Since these countries have a higher average income compared to Russia. And here, on the contrary, in this regard, Russia is the richest country in the world. But the people living there don't match the material wealth that Russia has. So, it's not just about natural resources. Maybe then it's really about corruption and the change of power. In general, forget everything that you've been told about this. The real reason why some countries in the world are living much wealthier than others right now is completely different. Here's a simple truth that for some reason many people, even seemingly smart ones, don't understand. In fact, what I'm about to explain should serve as a foundation for studying geography, economics, and politics. Although, no, it sounds complicated. What I'm about to explain and show should be taught to children in elementary school. According to what we know, the territory of our planet is divided among various states. And here's what you need to know about these countries. In the modern world, to make it easier to understand what the countries of our planet are like, they are characterized by various definitions. Countries that are similar in definition are grouped together, while different ones are divided. The simplest thing is the geographical division: countries of Latin America, countries of the Middle East, European countries, Scandinavian countries. And in this regard, there are no questions. If Egypt is an African country, then it's hard to argue with that statement. There are also divisions into maritime and landlocked countries. Maritime countries include England, the USA, Portugal, and Japan. Landlocked countries include Austria and the Czech Republic. As an example, there are no questions about that either. But a more interesting division is the political and economic one. During the existence of the USSR, countries were divided into first, second, and third world countries. The first world countries are essentially NATO, led by the USA. The second world refers to the socialist camp led by the USSR. The third world consists of those countries that did not align with either side. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all the countries on our planet were divided into developed and developing countries. Here are the so-called developed countries. These are the countries of the European Union, the United States of America, Canada, Israel, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. But the other countries, as you understood, are underdeveloped. Or, so that no one gets offended, they are called developing. This approach was proposed to replace the third world concept. It was proposed by World Bank economist Antoine Acmel, who was trying to replace the existing notion of the third world in public opinion. And that's where the most interesting part begins. What are developed countries? No one can really say, so there is no clear definition. Why is someone considered developed while another is seen as underdeveloped? If we take the economy into account, there are huge contradictions here. For example, China, a country with thousands of years of history, is today the world's largest economy by some measures, but it is still considered underdeveloped. Or an oil-producing country, Qatar, has been a leader in GDP per capita for many years, but it is also on the list of developing countries. Or how about this example? Estonia, which was part of Russia for many years, was on its periphery until the collapse of the Soviet Union, is now developed. And Russia, with its 1,000-year history and having been one of the centers of the world for many years, is now underdeveloped. Or, again, let's take the previously mentioned China. Here are the Chinese probes. They've already landed on the moon. Half the world. They walk around with their phones, even more. And China, a huge country, is considered developing. And Estonia. This, I apologize, is a little dot on the world map that by default can't have any resources at all. And in general, anything it is developed, it's absurd. Or Israel, which only appeared in 1948 and is developed, while Egypt, Syria, and other countries still can't develop after thousands of years. The definitions of developed and underdeveloped are provided by international specialized agencies of the UN. These are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. There are different criteria used to determine what type of country each one is. But there is no clear definition, as was said. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, defined a developed country as follows. A developed country is one that allows all its residents to enjoy a free and healthy life in a safe environment. Well, let's be objective. Such a country simply does not exist. In general, as you can see, everything is vague and lacks precision. And that's because the true definition of developed and developing countries is hidden from the people of the entire planet. These countries have another clear definition, but no one actually uses it. And because of political correctness, diplomacy, well, and simply elementary truth, it hinders many. The whole point is that previously the so-called developed countries were colonialist countries. So, the metropolises were those who plundered, while the developing countries were, accordingly, the colonies, with a few exceptions like Russia. As we know from history, Europe essentially colonized the entire world at one time, all of Africa and both South and North America. They were colonies. But in the 20th century, due to geopolitical interests, the USSR and the USA pursued a policy of decolonization. The United States did this because they didn't have their own colonies. The USA was founded by Europeans, who separated from Old World rulers. They weakened allies, removing colonies. These are the Europeans who simply decided to separate from their rulers from the Old World, that is, Europe. And in the mid-20th century, they happily weakened their allies in Great Britain, France, and other metropolitan countries, stripping them of their colonies. Well, so that they wouldn't have any competitors. Why do they need strong allies? As a result, the former colonies began to gain independence and at first glance became sovereign states. So, if you look at developed countries, they are often colonizers that have exploited other nations for centuries. And conversely, if you look at the so-called developing countries, then basically, with some exceptions, these are countries that were colonies, which are civilized Europeans living today in the so-called developed countries, actively exploited. And if anyone has wondered why African countries have such borders, drawn as if with a ruler, here's the answer. It's simply because the Europeans divided their territories like that. And now let's take the parasitic countries, that is, those that have plundered other countries for hundreds of years. And let's take the so-called developed countries, where, as they claim themselves, a relatively good life due to a special economic model. And so, we get the obvious answer to why some countries are developed while others are developing, even though their histories span thousands of years. That's it. Meanwhile, the scientists of the so-called civilized world are saying that developed countries are like this because they have a parliament, because supposedly there is freedom of speech, liberalism, and some kind of proper capitalism. But what about the fact that for centuries you were exporting tons of material wealth and free labor from Africa, India, China, and other countries? By the way, let me remind you that for many centuries, China was one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Until they were visited by the English. And that's exactly why China immediately became underdeveloped. As for Russia, today our country is considered a developing one. Although it seems like not long ago, as Alexander III said, Europe can wait while the Russian Tsar is fishing. And during Catherine the Great's time, not a single cannon in Europe fired without Russia's knowledge. And the USSR was the second largest economy in the world. And then bam, in an instant, our country suddenly became underdeveloped. Why? Because in 1991, Russia voluntarily surrendered itself into the arms of the West, which, for centuries, had been turning various states into colonies, which, in fact, Western countries happily did with Russia. Here's the simple answer to why some countries live relatively well and richly, while others languish in poverty. Here's another simple example for understanding. Many people praise European cities. They say how beautiful it is there, about those beautiful roads. In general, you can't compare it to some backwater town in Russia. Although it's all debatable, there are still plenty of beautiful European cities. Well, of course, why shouldn't they make their cities beautiful? When gold flowed there for centuries from plundered territories all over the world and slaves toiled there. Just imagine how your city would look if it were invested in 10 times more. Throughout your entire life? And what if such a rain of wealth had been pouring into your city since the time of your great-grandfather's great-grandfather? One single caravan from America brought to Spain. In 1703, 5 budgets of Peter the One, and he had to melt down the bells to fend off the next wave of robbers. Or here's another example. The British Isles, where London is located, which is peddled by pro-Westerners in Russia, with the words like, "Look how civilized people live." In terms of area, the territory of the British Isles is roughly the same as our Tomsk region. And just imagine if today, $4.5 trillion were invested in the Tomsk region, For comparison, the annual budget of the Tomsk region is about $1 billion. And today we are investing
$4.5 trillion
in the Tomsk region. Not billions, but trillions of dollars. So, do you think Tomsk would look better? And it's exactly that amount, $45 trillion, according to Dr. Patnaik from UCI, that the United Kingdom extracted just from India. And there are also China, Australia, America, Africa, and others. So, these 45 trillion need to be multiplied. So we're talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars. Of course, if you invest this money in any country, it will be well-groomed, beautiful, rich, developed, and civilized. For those comparing European and Russian cities, note that Russia lacked colonies, meaning it didn't have extra trillions of dollars. Europeans didn't face invasions like Russia did, nor were their cities plundered or destroyed as Russian cities were. Mainly, it was the same Europeans. And thirdly, our country, under Gorbachev and those who stood behind him, turned into a colony in 1991. If we talk about the numbers, as a result of this situation, hundreds of billions of dollars were drained from Russia every year. It itself turned into a colony in 1991. If we talk about the numbers, as a result of this situation, hundreds of billions of dollars were drained from Russia every year. For example, according to economist Glaziev, over the past 30 years, $1 trillion have been taken out of Russia. And that's just the capital outflow. What does that mean? Well, that means, for example, some oligarch like Friedman made money in Russia and then invested that money in Europe and the USA. By the way, he directly stated this: I say I have been living in London for 8 years. I invested billions of dollars in the UK and other European countries, meaning I took from Russia and gave to the West. And now, add those funds that people like Friedman siphon off from their home countries and send to the West to those trillions of dollars. Yet we're constantly told that the West lives relatively well because they have liberals, democracy, honest courts, and so on. I believe this is one of the biggest deceptions of humanity that almost everyone is silent about. Journalists, politicians, scientists, why don't they talk about this in school? These are just obvious things. Yes, absolutely. There are also other various facts that influence the development of a state. Well, for example, climate conditions. If people live in harsh conditions, they simply need to be more aware. To survive, you need to understand how to build a warm house, how to heat it, grow and preserve crops, and so on. Such problems do not concern people from warm countries, and accordingly, many branches of their economy simply cannot develop. But again, this didn't stop the aforementioned China from being, in essence, the world's leading economy for many centuries, or the Ottoman Empire from terrorizing Europeans. So, after all, robbing and enslaving other countries is the fastest way to get rich.
And here, Europe has succeeded better than anyone else.
And now about what is happening today. Unfortunately, at this moment, the essence of the relationships between countries hasn't changed. The metropolitan countries have remained metropolises, and the colonies have remained colonies with a facade of independence. Only the form of robbery has changed.
The old form of colonial governance has lived on. The tax collectors who physically gathered the tribute have become a thing of the past. A new form of governance has emerged. Next, I will explain it in detail. And now you need to understand how the so-called developed countries live in relation to others. That's right, because they have remained metropolises, parasites, living off others' resources. For example, the United States consumes up to 25% of the annual global volume of mineral resources, over 50% of the world's uranium consumption, about half of the aluminum used, as well as more than a quarter of the oil, natural gas, tin, copper, and iron ore that is extracted. At the same time, the United States does not give back substitutes and does not produce the same equivalent of any goods other than dollars. Much more goods are imported into the United States than the country exports abroad. There is a continuous redistribution of global wealth. Americans consume significantly more goods, generate more waste, and use more water than others globally. And at the same time, they generate 2 times more waste and use 3 times more water. Europe and America, whose population makes up only 20% of the total population of the Earth, consume 60% of all the products produced on the planet. If other countries consumed the same amount of goods, then we would need several planets, specifically 4. How is this possible? As already mentioned, the colonies of the metropolis remained, only the form of extraction has changed, as well as its name. To put it simply, the West, through various means, including military ones, made the whole world recognize the dollar as a value, equal to about 1 gram of gold. That's it. Imagine, $1 is no different from 1 gram of gold in terms of value. It's just gold. Not only do you need to extract it, but you also have to have it on your territory to extract it. But dollars are easy to print. And what do the Americans do? They just print dollars, and with them they buy various real material goods all over the world. So basically they are robbing... That's it. The euro situation is similar. The West robbing the world for centuries continues. Basically it's the same people. So the West, just as it has been robbing the rest of the world for centuries, continues to do so. The only thing that has changed is the form of the robbery. But how should a financial system be organized in a good and fair way? There should be an equal amount of money and goods. Roughly speaking, if you have goods worth $1 million in your country and you print money worth 1.5 million, then the prices of goods will rise, meaning inflation will increase. To restore balance. That's how the economy works. Something similar is happening today in Turkey. The Turks are printing unbacked money. Following that, prices rise. But the American dollar and the euro, unlike the Turkish lira, reserve currencies that the whole world buys for trade and storage, and so when dollars are printed for the needs of Americans, prices for goods rise all over the world. And in this way, the West spreads its problems all over the planet. Again, if Turkey does this, then those are purely Turkish problems. But if the West does this, then it's a problem for the whole world. The US national debt is already over $30 trillion. A significant portion of this money has literally been printed just like that and has gone to the needs of the United States. Other countries can't do that. In order to get money, they need to sell something. So overall, take a look at the map of the countries that live in debt. In other words, they print unbacked money with which they rob the whole world. Doesn't it remind you of something? Yes, it should remind you of a map showing the so-called developed countries. So this is yet another confirmation that developed countries simply live off others, like parasites. And absolutely every country where you can buy something with dollars and euros is being robbed daily. And, by the way, like this, Europe and America are going through various crises. They just print money and carry on living. In general, the dollar system is the largest financial pyramid in the entire history of humanity. And a little more about developed and underdeveloped countries. Some people might have questions about certain countries like Estonia, South Korea, and Singapore. Like, which of them are colonizers and who could Estonia possibly colonize if it was part of Russia? The thing is, Estonia is part of the supranational structure of the European Union. For some reason, the colonizers included it in their ranks and allow it to live relatively well. Well, the reasons are of course known. Next to it is the geopolitical enemy, Russia. Europe, just like before, simply seized part of the territory and annexed it. Estonia, like the other Baltic countries, essentially does not exist. These are not independent countries. They are regions of the European Union. This is territory seized by the Anglo-Saxons, which once belonged to Russia. And, by the way, how is it supposed to be? On the occupied territory, the troops of the victor are stationed. As for other developed countries with questionable status to be called metropolises, like South Korea, Japan, and Israel, you can point to any of these countries and find a NATO military base there. These countries are developed because they have some colonial experience, and they are developed in order to host NATO military bases at their own expense. So because of this, they are allowed to live relatively well. Let's sum it up. And the developed countries are countries, colonizers, and their vassals. Developing countries are essentially their colonies. How was it before? With some exceptions. After all, the world hasn't changed. I mean, the essence of the world order hasn't changed. Since the times of slavery, civilization has remained the same. So how do the metropolises, that is the developed countries, manage their colonies? Well, or more precisely, how do they make people recognize a simple piece of paper as valuable, alongside gold? First of all, the control is exercised through the fifth column. In other words, they bring their people to power in various ways, including through coups. And they do what needs to be done. Secondly, they impose their laws and orders so that there is a possibility to manage regardless of who will be the president there. In other words, they write laws for the occupied countries in their own interests. As is known, Western advisors helped write the Russian constitution. That's where the articles about how Russia's natural resources can be located came from. Essentially in any ownership. And that international law prevails over national law. And it's important to understand that the caring Europeans, similar laws were written not just for Russia. In general, the constitution is a development of the Anglo-Saxon world. And when talking about politics and economics, all these facts need to be taken into account. This situation should be known in all countries of the world, so that people understand that their country continues to be robbed every day. Thus, the rejection of the dollar will happen much faster, although these processes are already actively underway. And like the financial pyramid, the dollar won, will also inevitably collapse. It's just a matter of time. And that's all for now, friends. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.